We have been talking about Puritans on and off at various points in the 17th century, and I want to return to Puritans again for a couple of reasons. First of all, because of their development in the 17th century, as well as we just have so much more information about Puritan life in the 17th century than we do some of these other groups. We've talked about all sorts of things related to church and state. We've talked about witchcraft trials, all those kind of things. But I want to talk a little bit in this section about what's it like for the Puritans on the ground day to day, because they really provide a good insight into this kind of attempt by Christians to figure out what does it mean to be a Christian in your day-to-day life. Very important for the Puritan mindset, especially in the context of day-to-day life, was the concept of calling. There were three ways that Puritans used the term calling in their thinking. Ultimately, in all three of these, God was the one who called. And so, in each of these, God is the actor. God calls people to right action. And so, in thinking about you're faced with a situation, God calls you to do a certain thing. And what's the right action here? Well, God is calling you to right action. The second way God calls, of course, is with salvation. Now, of course, the Puritans, very Calvinist, believe in the elect. There are certain people that are chosen, but God called those people to salvation. And then finally, God called people to certain occupations, what was often referred to as the personal or particular calling. But one of the things that's different here is, and coming out of Luther, is this notion of calling referring to your occupation. In the Middle Ages, the term that's used calling was often referred to as estate. Remember the spiritual estate? And so calling was something that monks and nuns did. It was something related to the clergy. Luther argued that the term calling applied to what people did as a job. Street sweeper, pastor. Any calling in life, except for monasticism for Luther, was serviceable to God. And so all callings were equally important. And so a lot of the Puritan emphasis was on finding your calling. What's your calling in life? In Puritan life, of course, the domestic environment, the home, was very important. Now, because of that, of course, that does give women some authority, some sway, because of the mindset of being the home is the women's sphere. Women, however, could not vote in Puritan society, but they did have some legal rights. And more often than not, it was women who were recognized as visible saints. And this was kind of celebrated, how, here are women as spiritual examples. The domestic environment, though, even though it was the women's sphere, was very patriarchal. The father was over the house. But the family was also to be a place of religious instruction and guidance. And so there was a lot of emphasis in Puritan life on family devotions. And so as you had gone to the sermon on Sunday, and we'll talk more about sermons in a little bit, that message was to be reiterated throughout the week. And the father to bring to the family's mind the emphasis in the sermon. It was also encouraged to do Bible reading in the family. And so ministers kind of expected that what they preached would be reinforced in the home. And there in the home, the virtues of love, affection, and tenderness were heavily encouraged, which were often more exhibited by women than men. But the family was a model for the relationship with God for a lot of Puritans. God was husband and father. And so as human beings understood that, human men were to exhibit those characteristics as husbands and fathers. Ministers wrote guidebooks on family life, the importance of domestic order, frequently talked about it in their sermons as well. It even showed up in Puritan poetry, like the work of Anne Bradstreet, who was friends with Anne Hutchinson, but had some slightly different views. Anne Bradstreet was America's first published poet, first published woman poet. Her father had been a soldier to Queen Elizabeth. The family had moved to Massachusetts Bay in 1630. Both her father and her husband served as governors of Massachusetts. And in her poetry, of course, emphasizes a lot of the domestic life. And this poetry is taken to England and published in 1650. And gives us an insight into the relationships that a lot of Puritan families had, especially as we think about relationships between husbands and wives. In the Church of England at the time, there really wasn't too much of a formalized process of engagement and then moving on to the marriage. But in Puritan New England, no couple could be married unless their intention to be married had been announced in 3 successive public meetings. So you couldn't just get married on the fly. It had to be announced for 3 weeks in a row, or it had to be posted on, a written notice had to be posted on the meeting house door for at least 14 days. Wedding ceremonies in Puritan New England were done by civil officials, not ministers. Ultimately, this reflects the Puritans rejecting marriage as a sacrament. It still had a lot of religious significance, but they didn't hold to that notion that the Catholics did about it being a means of God's grace. Marriage was looked upon as a covenant, surprise for the Puritans, but essentially a very much a contract. Eventually, ministers would start doing marriages in 1686 when the Church of England had taken over the Massachusetts colony. Despite the impression that a lot of people get about Puritans, and there was a journalist in the 1920s, I believe it was, who said a Puritan is someone who is concerned that somebody somewhere is having fun. There were elements of that, but the marriage, the wedding, was followed by a grand party. There was a lot of feasting. It was discouraged at other times, but for a wedding ceremony, it was welcome, including the drinking of alcohol. The Puritans did drink beer, drank wine in certain circumstances. Marriage had to be consummated or it was not valid. So if the husband was impotent, the bride was freed from the contract. So again, that very contractual notion of all this. Divorce had to be handled by the civil magistrate. In England, you technically could not get a divorce. You could get an annulment, which is really what Henry got. He didn't get divorces, he got annulments. And so that was really the only way that the marriage bond was broken. In Puritan New England, however, divorce could occur for a couple of reasons. If the one spouse was really already married, you could get a divorce. If there was some sort of what they called criminal uncleanness, right, which is they've done something that's truly heinous, immoral, you could get a divorce. Incest could result in divorce. If one spouse was discovered to have had premarital sex, you could get a divorce. Or if they had maliciously deserted you, you could get a divorce after a certain amount of time. And you could get married again if divorce had been appropriately taken place. But the courts in Puritan New England didn't just sit back and wait for people to come to them with complaints. Often they actively got involved in situations that they deemed inappropriate. So, for example, if a man was seen consorting with a woman who was not his wife, and they were doing it too often, they might inject themselves and prohibit contact. Even if the wife wasn't complaining about it. They might say, you can't have contact with this person. If a husband wasn't supporting his wife properly, the courts could step in. The fundamental duties of Puritan marriage were peaceable cohabitation, sexual union and faithfulness, and economic support of the husband for the wife. Husbands and wives, though, were expected to be moderate in their love for each other. The concern was that their love, their affection for each other, could overshadow the love the individual was to have for God, and so moderation was encouraged. The other thing that was interesting about this idea about love is that usually Puritans decided to get married first and then figure out who it was they wanted to get married to. It usually wasn't, I want to marry this person, let's get married. It was, I want to get married, let me find somebody to marry. One of the chief factors in who to marry was social rank. It was encouraged that you marry somebody that was your social equivalent. You don't marry above or below your station. Also very important was, if you were a church member, you should look for another church member to marry. The assumption was love would be produced in that relationship after the decision to marry. So very few Puritans got married because they were in love with somebody. Love was usually secondary to that decision. Other things related to Puritan domestic life, of course, relationships between parents and children. The main duties of parents to their children are the ones that you think of: food, shelter, protection, but also education. Education was very important for the Puritans, both religious education and secular education. Education was seen as providing for their souls, and so it was very important for the family to educate them spiritually. And a lot of the education, even what we might call secular education, was done for religious ends. A child is taught to read so that they might read Scripture, because it's very important that you are able to read Scripture on your own. And the assumption was children are born evil and ignorant, and education can overturn this. Now, of course, Puritans believed in predestination, but they also believed education prepared children for salvation. And so you're kind of priming the pump, so to speak, for God to bring about salvation. Once a week, a father was supposed to teach his children, particularly using a catechism. A catechism was a document or a book that summarized the faith, summarized Christianity in a series of questions and answers. And so it was, by repeating these things, memorizing this, it was a way for children to learn the truths of Christianity. Even the text used in public schools, not quite public schools, but in schools, taught religious truths and morality. So everything about education for the Puritans was to promote religiosity. Discipline, of course, was also very important. Spanking and whipping did take place, but often as a last resort. Ministers encouraged Puritans to correct through kindness first, as much as possible, and then, if a child was particularly obstinate, then use some sort of physical discipline. Ultimately, you were also responsible for providing for your children and then helping them provide for themselves, helping them find their calling. Most girls, of course, ended up as housewives, and so studying was slightly different for them. Some boys ended up following their father's calling, but others would follow something else. Usually the calling was determined somewhere around the ages of 10 to 14, because you would be apprenticed 7 years in the house of a master, separate from your parents. God wouldn't specially reveal your calling. Revelation for the Puritans had ceased. So someone would have to, if you wanted to determine your calling, you'd have to ask things like, is this task I'm interested in useful to society? Does it provide some sort of social benefit? If it didn't, then it's not the right calling. If it doesn't provide anything to society for the Puritans. Does it fit in with my talents and inclinations? Right? These are the kind of things you would ask in determining your calling. But often it ended up being the father determined what your calling would be. He made the final decision. And given the amount of time it took to prepare for your job, there often tended to be very little switching of your occupation. And then finally, parents were also responsible for finding an appropriate spouse for their children, to make sure that they found somebody appropriate to marry. Because of this emphasis on education, Puritan New England had very large, very high rates of literacy. There was a lot of people able to read in Puritan New England because of the emphasis on reading the Bible.